In the heart of the New Mexico desert, under a vast starry sky, a freight train was rushing through the darkness. The train, filled to the brim with cargo, rumbled along the tracks that cut through the arid landscape. It was a routine trip for a crew hauling freight across the expanses of the Southwest. Among the crew was conductor Jake, a weathered man with years of experience on the rails. Working alongside him was his trusty engineer Mike, who skillfully drove the huge locomotive over rough terrain. Together they had seen everything from the scorching sun in the summer to the freezing cold of the desert in the winter. Leaving behind the glow of their beloved city surrounded by red cliffs, the train plunged into impenetrable blackness. The only source of light was the soft glow of the control panel and the distant stars that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Jake and Mike knew how important it was to stay alert on such long night journeys, and they were well aware of the dangers that could befall them. One such danger was a rendezvous, a scheduled meeting with another train on the same track. On such occasions it was necessary to turn off the lights and reduce speed to ensure safe passage. On this night, as they were preparing for the rendezvous, Jake noticed something unexpected. Ahead at the crosswalk, shadows were moving over the tracks. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. "Mike, did you see that?" asked Jake, curiosity and concern in his voice. Mike leaned closer, peering out into the night. "Yeah, I saw it. What do you think it is?" Jake couldn't be sure, but the shadows seemed to be human figures. As they drew closer, his heart raced. "Turn on the lights, Mike," he said urgently. Without thinking, Mike flicked the switch, flooding everything around him with a bright beam of light. What they saw stunned and horrified them. 4 children, very young, were standing between the tracks, just feet away from the oncoming train. The locomotive was hurtling forward at 70 miles per hour, and the realization hit Jake like a ton of bricks. 3 children panicked at the sudden brightness and rushed to run down the tracks. But one froze in terror. Jake's heart raced as he pulled himself up, trying to see the frozen figure over the nose of the train. The distance was rapidly closing, and he estimated that the boy was no more than 3 meters in front of them. "I'm stopping," shouted Jake to Mike, his voice shaking with fear. Mike nodded, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the control levers. Jake pushed hard on the emergency brakes, but the result seemed inevitable. The train kept moving forward, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The bicycle directly in front of the boy would hit the plow, and the sound that followed was one no one wanted to hear. Time seemed to slow down. The train stopped about 3,000 feet after the collision. Jake and Mike were shocked, their hearts pounding frantically. They exchanged perplexed looks. Jake turned to Mike, his voice shaking. "Did you see those kids?" Mike nodded slowly, his face pale. "I saw them, Jake. I saw the same thing." With a sinking heart, Jake contacted the dispatcher and informed him of the situation. They also contacted the oncoming train to make sure it was safe to proceed. While they waited for further instructions, the local police department arrived on the scene. Jake got off the locomotive to inform the police officers. They offered him a ride to the station, but he politely declined. He needed to inspect the train for damage or problems caused by the emergency stop. As he walked alongside the train, a signalman who was nearby approached him and asked him several times where the incident had occurred. Jake pointed to a spot near the intermediate signal and under the trestle, making it clear that he could not be missed. The liaison went in search of the place, and as he walked farther along the tracks he made a grim discovery. Half a mile from where Jake had seen the children, a lifeless body lay in a thicket of weeds. The body was cold, a tragic reminder of the earlier incident with the train. The signalman turned back to Jake, who was still examining the train. "I found the body," he reported grimly. Jake's heart sank even lower. "Was it one of those kids we saw?" The liaison shook his head. "No, it's not a recent case. It's some poor soul who was either run over or fell off a train some time ago." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. The night had taken a dark turn, and there were more questions than answers. As he continued to inspect the train, the signal guy drove up alongside him once again. "I couldn't find anything at the spot where we saw the kids," the signal guy reported. Jake was perplexed. "But we both saw them. It can't be a coincidence." The police officer, who had been waiting patiently, approached them with a stern expression. "Those kids you saw were killed in the 80s, right down to the red bike. We've had enough trouble with trains stopping and blocking our way home. Now my whole night is messed up because of this." Jake and the signal guy exchanged bewildered glances. The realization slowly sank in that what they had witnessed was not a recent event but a haunting echo from the past. The ghostly appearance of those kids had sent shivers down their spines, leaving them with an eerie sense of the unknown. As they continued their journey through the desert, the train rumbled on, carrying its cargo through the unforgiving night. The mystery of the ghostly figures would linger in their minds, a reminder of the countless tragedies that had occurred along these tracks over the years. The desert held its secrets close, and some stories were never meant to be fully understood. The rhythmic pounding of the wheels against the tracks echoed in the silence of the night as I drove the train through the deserted landscape. My name is John, and I've been a train driver for years, traveling the same routes night after night. The monotony of the job had become second nature to me, and I often felt lost in the hypnotic rhythm of the journey. On this night, I was accompanied by my trusty engineer David. During our time working on the tracks, we had seen all sorts of things: animals running across the road, abandoned cars on the side of the road, and even random vagrants trying to catch a hitchhiker. But what we encountered that evening was unlike anything we'd seen before. We were making our way through a neighborhood that seemed to be in the middle of the desert. The tracks curved around a deserted corner, and then we saw them, a tall shadowy figure and a frail elderly woman standing dangerously close to the tracks. Both were dressed in all black, which struck me as odd for a late evening encounter. As we approached, it became clear that something was wrong. The man, whose face was hidden by the darkness, stood behind the woman, hugging her tightly. Both of them were sobbing uncontrollably. Their muffled cries pierced the silence of the night, sending shivers down my spine. David and I exchanged concerned glances. We knew we had to do something. The safety of these men was at risk. There were no roads in this desolate area, and for miles we saw no cars or signs of life. It was as if these two men had appeared out of thin air and were standing dangerously close to the highway. I reached for the train intercom and informed the dispatcher of the strange situation. I described the eerie encounter to him and voiced my fears that it might be a suicide attempt. The dispatcher assured us that he would report it to the authorities and send help. For several minutes, we continued to approach the mysterious couple while our train rumbled ominously in the background. As we got even closer, I noticed the elderly woman clutching something in her trembling hand, a crumpled photograph. It was impossible to make out the details in the dim light, but it was clear that the photograph was of great importance to her. Her grief seemed unbearable, and the man trying to comfort her seemed to be carrying a heavy burden himself. The situation was surreal. There was no logical reason for these two people to be here, on the tracks, in the middle of the night, crying. It defied any explanation or common sense. Minute after minute crept by and our train slowed down, keeping a safe distance away. Dwight and I watched with heavy hearts, not knowing what would happen next. Just as we were about to make another attempt to contact them, the silence was cut through by the sound of distant sirens. Help was on its way. We were relieved, knowing that professionals would soon arrive to assess the situation and assist the mystery couple. But as the approaching headlights of the ambulances illuminated the neighborhood, something strange happened. The man and the elderly woman turned their heads in unison and looked at us, a mixture of despair reflected in their eyes. The emergency personnel who arrived quickly surrounded the couple and began to offer support and comfort. David and I watched them being led away from the highway, still clutching the crumpled photograph in our hands. The tension in the air gradually dissipated, but the mystery of their presence never left us. Later that evening, we learned that there had been no missing persons reports in the area for people matching their description. The identity of the pair remained a mystery, and the reason for their appearance that evening remained unknown. It was a cool, moonless night in the small railroad town of Ravenwood. The ticket office was a dimly lit room with a few worn chairs and a flickering fluorescent lamp overhead. Johnny, a heavy-set and experienced railroader with a handlebar-trimmed mustache, was engrossed in a lively conversation with his buddy Mike, whom he affectionately called Goat. They had just finished their shift and were relaxing, exchanging stories and laughter over a mug of steaming coffee. As Johnny and Mike were exchanging stories about their adventures on the rails, the door to the ticket office creaked open, drawing their attention. Two railroad men, Eddie and Jake, from the eastbound side of the line, piled into the ticket office. Their faces were ashy and they looked as if they had seen a ghost. Johnny and Mike exchanged perplexed glances. "Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Johnny asked, curious. Eddie cleared his throat nervously, trying to find the right words. "You won't believe what just happened out there," he finally managed to say. "We were sitting outside of town waiting for a stoplight, you know. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, pitch black. And then, we saw him." "Who saw who?" asked Mike, leaning forward. Eddie continued. "This guy was standing at the edge of the woods, not far from the railroad tracks. He was dressed in full camouflage, blending in with the trees and the darkness." Johnny's eyes widened, listening intently. The atmosphere in the booking office changed from friendly to eerie tension. Jake shuddered, remembering that chilling encounter. The creepiest part was when the conductor noticed him. He closed the doors to the locomotive, but the guy, he kept coming closer and closer. Eddie nodded in agreement. "And he had a shotgun," Johnny, strapped right over his shoulder like he was out for a walk. The expression on Mike's face darkened. "What did you guys do?" We didn't know what to do," Jake admitted. "We froze, scared to death. This guy, he snuck up on the engine, slow and purposeful, like a damn ghost." Johnny leaned forward, urging them to continue. "And then what happened?" Eddie swallowed hard, his voice becoming a barely audible whisper. "He climbed up on the nose of the locomotive and just stared at the conductor." There was silence in the room. Johnny, Mike, Eddie and Jake trying to comprehend the surreal events they had heard. Seconds passed, and the tension hung in the air like a thick fog. Finally, Mike broke the silence, his voice barely audible. "How long was he in there?" Jake's voice shook as he answered, 10 minutes. It seemed like an eternity to me. He didn't move, and neither did the conductor. We were too scared to do anything." Eddie added, "And then, as if nothing had happened, he just got off the engine and headed back into the woods." Johnny ran a hand over his bushy mustache, his thoughts racing. "What happened after he left?" Jake answered, "Just as he disappeared into the woods. The signal lights finally came on. They didn't waste a second. They hit the gas, to hell with the restraints, and tore out of there with as much speed as that engine was capable of." The room fell silent again, and the reality of the situation became apparent. Johnny, Mike, Eddie, and Jake were experienced railroaders, used to dealing with all kinds of difficulties on the tracks, but this was something else entirely. In one town, the local railroad station served as a source of vitality. Trains ran like clockwork, carrying goods, passengers, and the promise of progress. Among the dedicated shipyard workers was a diligent young engineer named Olivia Anderson, known for her meticulous approach to her work. One crisp fall morning, as the sun cast long shadows across the shipyard, Olivia's sharp eyes caught something unusual. She'd been inspecting the tanks, performing routine maintenance to ensure the safety of the cargo being transported. But today her routine was disrupted when she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. On one of the tankers lay bloody razors incomprehensibly glued to the grippers. At first she thought it might be a strange prank, but the dark scarlet stains on the razors were very real. Olivia's heart raced in her chest as she thought about the implications. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was lurking here. Olivia decided to discreetly remove the razors and take them to her supervisor, Mark Mitchell, an old railroad veteran. Wrapping the razors in a napkin, she hurried into his office, figuring out her options as she went. When she showed Mark the razors, he furrowed his eyebrows in concern. "This is no joke, Olivia," Mark said seriously. "We have to report this immediately." Together they contacted the railroad authorities and local law enforcement. There was a sense of unease in the air as they waited for the investigators to arrive. Investigators arrived, led by Detective Michael Reynolds, an experienced officer with a reputation for solving the most intricate cases. As he examined the razors, the expression on his face grew increasingly grim. "These razors didn't end up here by accident," Detective Reynolds said. "They were put there on purpose. A blood-borne disease can be contracted through these razors. We've done an examination." They began by interviewing railroad employees, looking for any clues that might lead them to the culprit. A tense atmosphere arose in the close circle of friends. In the course of the investigation, It was discovered that some of the employees had grievances against the railroad's management. Among them was Harold Denton, a disgruntled employee who had recently been fired because of erratic behavior. He had blood-borne diseases and was becoming increasingly embittered. The investigation soon uncovered a connection between Harold Denton and the Bloody Razors. CCTV footage showed that he had been near the cisterns on the night the razors were placed there. Under pressure, Harold cracked.